Thank you, Marla, for that prayer. I was just reading this morning as the point of the message today is titled, Why Sabbath? And so it actually popped up in a Bible study on the end of times, but Adriana and I were reading this morning Jeremiah 17, and the prophet is scolding or warning the Israelites about breaking the Sabbath, and he sums it up in how they've broken the Sabbath was that they carried their burdens through the gates of Jerusalem. And that kind of summed up for the prophet how they had offended the point of the Sabbath. And Marla's prayer of just, we come and we lay our burdens down. There's time enough tomorrow to pick them up again. But today should be a blessing for your rest. And I hope to encourage you today in embracing the Sabbath as a time to lay your burdens down. But before we get into the message, there's a couple of tools that will help you track today. If you have not yet downloaded our new app, our OAC app, I encourage you to do so because we have a poll running, so you can participate in that poll right now, as well as sermon notes. So we're trying to do some fill in the blanks for those of you who are very studious and like to track and be detail-oriented. Also at this time, boys and girls, you're invited to attend Kids Church. They've actually prepared a really fun program for you in the chapel. So anyone 12 and under that does not want to, or older, who doesn't want to listen to me but would rather do some coloring and games, you are welcome to join the kids in the chapel where they'll have a really fun interactive time. But we are competing with interactivity by using our OAC app. So if you don't have it, you can try texting 77977, and in that text bubble, all lowercase, OAC Vancouver space app. Samir, I don't know if we have a slide from last week to just show them how they might get the app, but if you can find that and put it up, that's terrific. Also, I'm going to need you to also grab a screen capture. I don't know if Robert's up there or you're up there with your app to see what people are saying on our poll. So we put a poll in your notifications. So if you have the OAC app, you'll see at the bottom menu notifications. You can click on that notification. And our question that was put out last night was, which word reflects your Sabbath experience best? Which word reflects your Sabbath experience best? And the words that were your options to select in the poll are rest, worship, fellowship, or food. So I know some of you who are taking a digital detox today and are not on your phones. That's terrific. So we'll do it old school as well. Between rest, worship, fellowship, and food, we'll take a physical poll by a show of hands. So thinking about a word to capture your Sabbath experience, and I know you might have your own unique words, but out of those 4 options, how many would associate their Sabbath experience with rest? Wow, I'm thinking that's maybe just a quarter, barely a quarter. How many associate it with worship? Raise your hands for worship. Actually, I think that's... And how many would put fellowship, so connecting with friends and family? Oh, that's so far our leading majority. And what about food? Only 2 or 3 people put their hands up for food. Very interesting. I don't know if you're tracking with your poll, either Samir or Robert, what our poll is actually saying. When I looked at it this morning, it looked like a tie between worship and fellowship. I'm not sure if that's still the case because I left my phone in my office, but just give me a thumbs up if it still looks that way to you. Or anyone else who's looking at their app right now can tell me. Worship's leading. Interesting. Now fellowship is. Oh, fellowship has got the leading, the most parts. Well, if you're using your app, I'm going to be making some statements where you can fill in the blank, but I'm not actually going to show those on the slides, so that it's just for you as an added bonus, as some enrichment to fill in the blanks. But we're revisiting, been moving through a teaching series called Authentic Adventism, kind of getting back to the roots that what makes us peculiar and where we should stay peculiar and where we should maybe reflect on our core identity. So it's in our very name as Seventh-day Adventists to tackle this topic of the seventh day and why it matters to us and why we find it so significant and why it's currently setting us apart from other Christian denominations. So if you are wanting to open your Bibles with me, we're going to start at the very beginning. And I think this is the most essential text is to reflect where we see Sabbath first mentioned in the Bible. And we come across it in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. This concludes the 6 days where God has created spaces and filled them with wonderful things. And Genesis 2 verse 3 says, God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from the work he had done in creation. So if you're filling in the blanks, the first blank is Sabbath was first established when? Sabbath was first established at creation. There you go. I just gave you the answer right in front of you. Sabbath was first established at creation. Now here's the trickier part. How would you fill in these blanks? As a day of rest? As a day to worship? I know it's not directly in the text. Now I'm teasing your brains to work a little bit harder in discerning the meaning. So Sabbath was established at creation as some of you say day of rest, day of worship, as a holy day. And I'm going to challenge you today with what I filled in the blank with, and that is Sabbath is a gift of grace. Sabbath is a gift of grace. You see, other religions in the world tend to dictate the actions that need to be done in order to worship. So you must prepare certain foods. You must provide certain offerings. You must say particular prayers. You must walk backwards on your knees uphill for X amount of distance. There's a lot of prescribed actions required in other religious mandates on how you should worship. And I think it is so unique that biblical worship begins with a gift of grace, the gift of rest. The very first thing that we need to do to truly worship is to take a break. I mean, Adam and Eve were just created on the sixth day. They only had one task, which was to name the animals, and I don't really see that as being too laborious. What kid doesn't enjoy being given a big furry teddy bear or a new doll and told, you get to name it, or that little puppy or that little kitten, and you're so excited, and the first thing you want to do is name it and connect with it. So basically, they got to just survey creation and name the animals and take in the garden, and before they do any work to prepare a home or to prepare a meal, God says, sit back, relax, and enjoy. And I think that is the heart of worship, is this attitude of gratitude that comes from recognizing that God did everything for us. He prompted us and provided us to worship Him. He created us as human beings, not human doings. And as somebody who is a workaholic, I struggle with this, but the Sabbath message reminds me that God's intent when He first created was not to work your 6 days and then earn the reward of the Sabbath, but He created mankind, humankind, and the first thing before they toil or labor, even though it wasn't burdensome before sin, He gifts them this grace and bestows upon them the very first holiday. Now, in North America, we're often clamoring for more holidays. It wasn't too long ago that we didn't have a holiday in February, but BC and the other provinces began to adopt a Monday in February called Family Day, because they recognized that our culture and society is moving so fast-paced and is so production-oriented that for the good of the people, we needed another holiday. Well, God in his grace has given us a holiday every week. A holy day, a holiday, same word, same meaning. And in holidays, if you're from the States or you have American connections, you know they just celebrated a huge holiday, their Thanksgiving. And it involves fellowship, coming together with friends and family. It involves rest, taking a day off work for most people. It involves some kind of worship if you're following a particular football team, and it involves food. And I would say these are all the core components of the Sabbath holiday, is that we were called to come together in fellowship with each other, in fellowship with God. We were meant to feast on Sabbaths. The Bible and Jewish law said it's wrong to fast and abstain from food. In fact, food is so integral to the Sabbath that when God led his people through the wilderness, out of Egypt and in the wilderness, he was providing for them manna, a double portion on Fridays, so they would get to enjoy all the food without any of the work. This is the primitive Hebrew word for Shabbat that's on screen, or it will be on screen. I tapped it, but I might need some support from the balcony. Thank you. There you go. So it's made up of 3 letters, and of course it's read right to left with the Shabbat. That first symbol you can see is written like 2 teeth. Like 2 teeth. That's like your front buck teeth. And the middle symbol is the image of a tent of gathering. And the last symbol represents a monument, a memorial, a landmark. So we often think of and describe the Sabbath as a landmark or a memorial in time instead of in place, because it's universal. And when I saw the 2 little teeth there in the symbol, I just thought that was so fun. And God has such a neat sense of humor to instill that in the Jewish language and in the alphabet there. But that teeth don't just represent eating, but they also represent this whole word together, the eating, gathering in the tent, and the monument. Shabbat means to rest, to cease. And that's where the teeth might be connected in terms of cutting off, to be setting apart. When God blesses the Sabbath and hallows it, it is a sanctification in setting it apart and establishing it as unique and special. Exodus 20 verse 10 is where we capture one record of the Decalogue, those 10 commandments given to Moses by God. And in Exodus 20 verse 10, it says, the 7th day is a Sabbath of who? The Jews? The Adventists? What does your Bible say? The 7th day is a Sabbath of God, the Lord your God. And if we read on, we realize it is for everyone. The instructions are to observe the Sabbath rest of the Lord and to bestow that grace that he gave you to everyone within your gates, everyone within your household, everyone that you might have power or authority or influence over. That is the meaning and the act of observing the Sabbath. Now, some of your translations might be reading, the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord. But if you go back again to the authentic Hebrew text, you will see the phrase of the Lord your God, that same language, that same wording, being referenced to the presence of the Lord, to the name of the Lord, to the sound of the Lord, and the hand of the Lord, all in Genesis and Exodus. And I think it's really significant to get that translation correct. If the Sabbath is to the Lord, it kind of implies that we have to observe and conduct ourselves in a way that is pleasing to the Lord. But when we read this text, it is the 7th day, it is the Sabbath of the Lord. We recognize that he is the one who owns it. It's his day. It belongs to him just as his name belongs to him, just as his hands belong to him, just as his voice belongs to him. The Sabbath is God's. And so when he says, share it with everyone, make the Sabbath rest available to everyone, it is in a way that we pass the peace, or we pass on the grace given to God. The Sabbath in itself also embodies this notion, our understanding, and yes, even our doctrine, that all people are created equal under God. Because the Sabbath day, your servants, your slaves, your animals, even your children could not be designated to do any work for you. You would rest and you would worship shoulder to shoulder as equals. This is the social justice of the Sabbath. In Matthew 12:8, we see that Jesus reinforces his identity as Lord of the Sabbath. And we see that this existence, or this identity, or this quality of Jesus is that he was Lord of the Sabbath yesterday when he created the world and established the Sabbath. He is Lord of the Sabbath today for me as we still observe it, and he is Lord of the Sabbath forever. If you want scripture references for how we will continue to observe the Sabbath throughout eternity, you can check your app, or you can jot down Isaiah 66, verse 22 and 23, or Hebrews chapter 4 speaks about the Sabbath rest that remains for God's people. You see, we often break down the Bible and its instructions in terms of Old Covenant and New Covenant. There was a covenant given to the Israelites, and there was a new covenant that Jesus opened up in his life. So we think about Old Testament, Old Covenant, New Testament, New Covenant. But the Bible teaches us there was this everlasting covenant that existed before sin, before the fall. And as Christ is Lord of the Sabbath, he enacts that as our creator in the past, as our redeemer present day, and our restorer in the future. In fact, I find it really fascinating. The more you study it, the more parallels you will find between the creation account and particularly Christ's crucifixion and the work of salvation. In fact, in the Old Testament, when we compare the Exodus account of the Ten Commandments and the Deuteronomy account of the Ten Commandments, the Sabbath is referenced slightly differently. In Exodus, we're reminded that the Sabbath is a monument of creation. But in Deuteronomy, it's prefaced with the fact that with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, God delivered and rescued his people. And that's why they need the Sabbath, to remember their salvation. So when you jump into a study of the Gospel of John, it begins with Jesus being the Word at the beginning, who spoke all things. You have this creation language that's being echoed and conjured up. And interestingly enough, when John talks about Jesus' final words, he makes a point to use the words Jesus spoke at sunset on Friday, when he declared, "It is finished." Does that ring a bell from the Genesis account? When God surveyed everything he had made, he used those exact words, "It is finished." And how do you commemorate the accomplishment of that work, whether it's the creative work or whether it's the saving work? Is that you rest, you reflect, and you take it in. As I was studying, I kind of wondered, I had this thought that I never thought before, but I wonder, in establishing the timing of Sabbath, where God instructed that our days actually begin at sunset and they end at sunset to sunset, or we're in a Western culture very disconnected with that because we run on a 24-hour clock and our day begins when the alarm clock goes off in the morning. But God had set an appointed time management system that was above human invention. And he said, I want you to begin this day of rest with sleep. I want you to begin it when the lights are out and you have no ability to not observe the Sabbath. So there's even another layer of his grace in that he kind of forced humanity. He kind of made it so easy for them to embrace rest because it began at nighttime. And I wonder if it was foreshadowing or just coincidence that Jesus was crucified, and when he pronounced those words, "It is finished," darkness fell. It closed the day and it began the Sabbath with the veil of darkness. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think maybe in that is a foreshadowing or a reinstatement of God's eternal narrative and his everlasting covenant. At that moment that Christ declared, "It is finished," something else happened. Darkness fell, but the veil that was in the most holy part of the tabernacle or the temple tore in two. That was a divine statement and a symbol that the barrier that once existed between humankind and their access to God existed no more. Jesus had opened a new way of experiencing God's presence. And I think Jesus' death actually restored in that moment a new significance of the Sabbath. It was a step in reconnecting with the Sabbath, which was the Eden type of Sabbath, which was a communion that was without barrier to God, that was easy access. On Friday, Jesus demonstrated his power of his love to save us. And on Sunday, he revealed the power of his love to restore us. And we see that in Sunday's resurrection, the cycle of recreation begins again as light comes back into the darkness. Sabbath is both a weekly reminder of our identity as created beings who worship our Creator, but it's also the memorial of salvation. Creation is so much about life and giving life that the drudgery and the dark task of preparing the dead, Christ's own dead body, was deferred. They would not conduct anything beyond necessary once darkness fell in preparing Christ's body. They only wrapped it and laid it in the tomb. And we discover that as the women waited until Sunday with their burial spices to actually do the work of embracing death. And I think God's grace is seen even in that moment, that he prevented them from having to really face and really encounter and do the work of facing death, but gave them that Sabbath rest. Yes, Jesus said that Sabbath was made for humanity, and he encouraged us to follow his own example in keeping the Father's commandments, even the Sabbath. He was a Sabbatarian. You can read about it in John 15, verse 10-14, where he said, follow as I do in keeping my Father's commandments, in order that your joy might be full. He's saying that in embracing the Sabbath and really observing and keeping it, we will have a life that is rich in love and rich in joy. Isaiah 48, verse 17 also says, "If you had only followed my instructions, then you would have peace like a river." How many of you have sung that song as kids or around a campfire? "I have peace like a river." Well, it's a Bible song. It's based in Isaiah 48. In my translation, it says, "If you keep my commandments, you will be flooded with peace," which I just love that language. It's much stronger language. So yes, we find the Sabbath situated in God's moral code. And that, to me, again, reinforces how significant it is in encouraging us and instructing us how we show respect to our Creator, how we show respect to our Savior, but also recognizing each other, because those first 4 commandments are about respecting God and how we might worship authentically and sincerely. But the other majority of the commandments are about how we relate to each other, how we show each other respect, how we care for each other, how we protect our community with a moral code. And in remembering the Sabbath, we observe it in the words of Micah, but to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God. These are the things that are appropriate for Sabbath activity. I often get that question, well, do you think it's okay to do X Y, Z on the Sabbath? People want to know because there's a lot that isn't mentioned in this book. Is it okay to watch television? Is it okay to garden? Is it okay to go swimming? And usually I fall back on two questions that are embedded in the Ten Commandments. In keeping the Sabbath, are you doing activities that help you connect with your Creator? And when it relates to other people, are you actively engaged in harm reduction or harm prevention? So is it okay to watch TV on the Sabbath? Well, some people would say it's not about the TV, but it's about the content. Rather than kids watching cartoons where there's like gratuitous violence and underhanded humor, maybe they opt to watch VeggieTales or some cartoon that's relaying a Bible story, because that's a time to refocus our minds and our thoughts on the power of God's Word and the beauty of His stories. Or is it okay to play soccer on Sabbath? And I would say this idea of Sabbath keeping as harm reduction or harm prevention, it informs and it shapes my reflection on the morality of what we do. In kicking a soccer ball in the backyard with family members, I think there's a powerful connecting force that can happen during that quality time. In playing in a competitive league, I'd have to ask myself, how can I legitimately show up to a competitive sports league game and not be wishing the other person harm on some level? Because I want to win, and I want them to lose. So in my mind, if I rationalize it, competitive sports put me in a mindset that desires harm on somebody else, even if it's just the psychological harm of a loss. Where cooperative activity, cooperative games can be very bonding and community forming and family strengthening. Just some things for you to ponder, but those are my reflective lenses. Does this aid in my connection with the Creator? Doing artwork, doing creative baking actually connects me with my Creator, because I find the joy in being able to create something. If cooking and baking is a drudgery and work, then I would say it's taking you out of a Sabbath mindset. You see, 1 John 5:3 says that God's instructions, His rules for life, are not meant to be burdensome. They are to bless us. Jesus said the Sabbath is a blessing. I made it for humankind. And God will guide and direct us, because that's really the essence of the understanding of Sabbath, is surrender and rest and trust that He will provide, that He will provide discernment in how to observe it. He will provide our strength. He will provide our joy in being faithful to keeping and testing Him, and to see that He is actually good and He keeps His promises. The danger, of course, has been in Sabbath legalism. And for that, I look at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, because He talked about those rules or those prescriptions in His sermon. He was targeting those who were at fault for taking His true religious meaning and corrupting it with legalism. In Matthew 5, He says to the leaders, well, for sure you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But the legalists were interpreting that in the narrowest possible sense. How much can I get close to that and still skate around my guilt? Well, it's akin to leaders today who say, yes, I put that substance to my lips, but I didn't inhale. Or the teenagers that tell me, well, we were just sharing a blanket. Anyone who looks with lust has already committed adultery in their own heart, is what Jesus said. And for Sabbath keepers, this means that in a rigid, judgmental approach, we actually violate the heart of the Sabbath, because Sabbath was meant for our rest and our rejuvenation. So standardizing behaviors in order to save us actually takes the place of Jesus' power to save us. So anyone who keeps God's Sabbath in order to get saved is repeating the same mistake that those Jewish Pharisees and leaders were doing in perverting the very truth and core of what it means to rest and trust and have faith on the Sabbath. When it becomes a requirement for salvation, you're not actually entering rest at all. You've just subverted it to another deed. We point to a Sabbath in which Christ says, "It is finished. My salvation is complete." Just want to share one quote from this author, Priscilla Shirer, who speaks about the Sabbath joy and blessing in her book, Breathe, Making Room for the Sabbath. And I don't know if my last, the next one. I'm tapping it, Smear. There we go. But maybe the connection isn't as reliable as we hoped, so. And now we're in a power struggle for control over the slides. Priscilla Shirer says, God gave us the Sabbath to refocus our attention, to cause us to bring to the center of our minds and hearts the very person who we have placed on the periphery for far too long. Margin keeps us from marginalizing God. Powerful statement there. Today I've invited a guest to join me in talking about the Sabbath. I met her through Missions Fest. She's our church relations coordinator. And in visiting our board and our ministry team over the last couple years, she shared with me that she's on this journey of Sabbath keeping. And I actually had the delight, and I will say it was a delight to read your dissertation. It's not always a delight to read people's dissertations, but this one was very intriguing and compelling to me, because it addressed the gospel relevance for Vancouver. And so I'm going to invite Claudia to join me. I'm going to grab a couple stools, and we're just going to chat a little bit about the Sabbath keeping discovery. And there you go. There's a stool for you, and you can grab either one of those mics. Because I feel like sometimes as Sabbath keepers, especially if we grew up as Seventh-day Adventists, we tend to take for granted the joy and the blessings that we have. And sometimes it takes somebody who's fresh to this idea to inspire us of the joy and the blessing. And that's what I found just in our coffee shop conversations, that I was way more inspired to reevaluate and dig deeper into Sabbath observance. So please have a seat. Welcome. I'm so glad you agreed to join. Yes, we'll give her a warm welcome. And so I would just wanted to open up and have you share a little bit about your journey, your study and understanding the Sabbath. And I read in your dissertation, you used this language, the economy of enough. And for me, that was Sabbath language when you said the economy of enough. So I just was curious, which convictions led to which? Were you thinking about economy enough and it led you to Sabbathing, or were you thinking about the Sabbath and it led you to economy of enough, or were they intertwined?
Okay. Thank you for having me. And I have this deep joy and admiration for the Adventist Church, as I was sharing with Rhoda. All my upbringing, if you're wondering where my accent is from, I'm originally from Bolivia, and I grew up working in humanitarian work with Food for the Hungry. And we had an Adventist organization, and I really looked up their commitment to keeping the Sabbath. So our funders, the USAID was one of the main ones, would actually never schedule meetings for Friday because they know that Adventist organizations would not show up. And I thought that was such a great testimony to our faithfulness to God. So I am very blessed to be here and to learn more. I'm hoping to have more conversations with Rhoda. So my journey was a little scary, actually. I went to Regent College, and maybe about this, I've been a Sabbath keeper maybe for the last 8 years, but at the beginning it was a very scary journey for me. I love productivity. I have this lust for relevance, which is pretty scary sometimes, and it's all under sometimes words of connected to mission and purpose, but then it gets out of hand sometimes. So as I was reading the scripture more seriously in postgraduate education, I learned that I realized that I was just keeping 9 commandments, but giving myself somehow some license to not keep the 4th one. And so I started reading more, and I realized that I grew up in a Pentecostal home. I don't know what this means for most of you, but it's a very charismatic, sort of New Testament focused type of reading of the Bible. And Sabbath keeping was more connected to the Old Testament, and because Jesus brought us to have a more holistic understanding of Sabbath, where every activity or every day of the week is Sabbath. So therefore we didn't keep an official day, because every day was supposed to be Sabbath, and every day is supposed to be Christmas, and I still have my my reservations about that now. But anyway, so that was sort of the attitude that I grew up in. And when I decided, okay, God, it sounds that Sabbath is an actual day. Okay, so I'm going to try, because I worship on Sundays at a Baptist church. I thought, okay, I'm going to try for all day Sunday. And then I remember having it so hard to work on my last word on my paper for Regent, and thinking, oh man, it's noon, it's midnight. Oh, I can't believe this. But the first weeks was such a struggle, thinking, oh, I'm missing out. And then I'm not even able to sleep because I'm thinking of my paper and the stuff that I didn't write about. And but it slowly became very freeing practice. So then I realized, okay, I started doing more reading, and one of the books that I loved was Keeping the Sabbath Holy, as in W-H-O-L-L-Y, by Marva Dawn. And there she talks about this beautiful experience of sleeping in God's rest, and then waking up in that sense of restfulness. So refreshed, totally. So my husband and I decided to, okay, we're going to do from 6 p.m. on Saturday to 6 p.m. on Sunday. And the 6 p.m. came out, I don't know from where, to be honest. But that's how we keep it now. We do a little candle ceremony of light the candles, where one candle means memory, the other one means hope, and one candle means creation, and the other one means redemption. So we try to do it very sort of liturgically. Yeah, and it has been a very testing practice at the beginning for my marriage, because, during the Sabbath you are supposed to do creative things. But neither my husband nor I grew up in any Sabbath-keeping environment. Therefore, we didn't also have any sort of artistic outlet. So there we were, both of us looking at each other. Okay, so what are we going to do now? Okay, let's so we took on something creative that we thought we would both enjoy. So it was candle making for Sabbath. And that became a realization that we're so different in our personalities. He's very perfectionist, so for me it was like good enough. The wick is a little weird, but anyway. But then it was like, no, it needs to be good. So it was such a self-realization of who we are not and what we're missing. So I'm actually hoping to learn more from Rhoda. She sent me some links on how to raise my child with Sabbath keeping, and all the things she can do, and all the things she has been missing, or I was missing, for not having the Sabbath while I was growing up. And so the economy of enough came as a sense of reminding us of when the Israelites in the desert had to gather manna, right? Like the fact that some of them chose to gather more, not just enough, but the ones who chose to gather more, it ended up going bad.
Spoiling.
So it's this sense of, yeah, enough is enough. Why do I need to put an extra word on my paper? Why do I need to... it's a sense of a boundary that's freeing. Otherwise, I have a very perfectionist friend I really care about, and she says, I cannot stop being perfectionist, and that's what the Sabbath frees me from, right? Frees you from your own sense of perfection, and that applies to economy and other parts of our lives, yeah.
You have a slide prepared about Sabbath worship, so I'm just share.
So this is where I have came to land. I realized that Sabbath keeping is about right worship, and worship comes from the word, what do we assign the highest worth to? And for me, the two options are connected to the story of Elijah. On the left, you see Yahweh is the God of creation. Who do we really worship? And I love St. Thomas Aquinas' substitutes for God, which is wealth, pleasure, power, and honor. What makes our Sabbath not just a weekend where we can do everything we want, that frees us from the God of pleasure. So I feel that in our modern culture, weekends, which is when Sabbath happens, are basically a display of your wealth. I mean, you go and show off your awesome car, or you even don't even break because you're working so hard to accumulate wealth. Or you just have as much pleasure as you want, you binge a Netflix show until you are about to puke. So it's all about pleasure or display of power, you're accumulating power. So I feel that I realize now that the Sabbath is a statement of whom I truly worship. And it's like a freedom. And I love the story of Elijah because sometimes we have our children and our lives revolving around the altars of pleasure and wealth and power and honor, and we're harming ourselves like the prophets of Baal. Right? Like they're running around, their lives revolve around those altars, and they're harming themselves and their children. Whereas the God of Elijah is the only one who can respond with fire. Is the only one who responds in the first place. So I feel that the Sabbath is this sort of tangible choice of who I really worship. I mean, who does my schedule, my life revolve around?
I love that question that you put there. Around whose altar do our lives revolve? So and especially going back to the Hebrew characters, the monument is altar, so the altar of Sabbath is there. And so what a profound question. Around whose altar are we operating? Are we existing? And it brings to mind, again, the Old Testament challenge. There is in the Old Testament Levitical law, a prescription of death if somebody violates the Sabbath. And part of me, initially you go, wow, that's so harsh that God would condemn someone to die for breaking the Sabbath. But really, what are we doing if we run 24/7 over capacity? We're just slowly killing ourselves. So it's almost like he was stating that as a warning. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to break my Sabbath. You're going to kill yourself, basically. You're destroying yourselves, just as this parable, this story, and the parallel, the comparison is also, with the priests destroying themselves for the sake of something that's empty and not going to respond, not going to provide.
And the tragedy is sometimes we have parents or family members who are killing themselves working, but in that they're killing their family because they're absent. So then their children are not able to see them. And I don't want to condemn people who have to do 2 or 3 jobs to live in Vancouver. I know there's that reality too, but I think the Sabbath is such an act of resistance against the modern gods of our life, of our day.
It's very powerful. Your next slide, we've been chatting a little bit about Sabbath as freedom and Sabbath as a tool for social justice. So your paper was really examining one of Vancouver's greatest concerns, which is social isolation. And how do you see the Sabbath playing a role in meeting this need that we have right here in our community, in our city?
I think 2 of the main things that my life revolves around is the Sabbath now. I'm like newly discovering the Sabbath, so I'm envious about many of you guys that have had generations of Sabbath keeping. So to me, it's like this discovering this awesome law now, so I'm tasting it. And so I did my dissertation around social isolation, and I wanted to know what is the issue of biggest concern in Vancouver. And by now, you probably, if you listen to CBC, the CBC is doing a series on social isolation. And the tragedy of social isolation is that it's not just how sad I am feeling alone, but it actually can be very lethal. So it can increase your odds for an early death by 45%. And this compares to living with air pollution, increases your odds for an early death just by 5%. Living with obesity increases your odds for an early death by 20%. Living with excessive drinking increases your odds for an early death by 30%. Living with loneliness and isolation increases your odds by 45%.
Wow.
So it's really dead producing. And if you have a mental health challenge connected to that, then things just go downwards. So I realized that that's an important issue, and I really loved the Vancouver Foundation did a research in 2012 and redid it in 2017, and they asked how can faith communities better organize themselves to help create a more connected Vancouver. So that's the question I tackled. And I just came to this incredible realization that the Sabbath is the biggest solution. Because if you see that slide, a lot of social isolation is about self-perception. One of the most quoted reasons why people do not engage in community activities is they felt they had little to offer. So it's an issue of self-perception of identity. So sometimes our isolation is just in our mind. That's why I have that image of like you're just imprisoned. And sometimes people have reported in Vancouver that they feel actually trapped, right? Like there are issues of systemic issues and individual issues about social isolation. Some of the systemics are culture. Vancouver values independence over community. Even city planning, the way we plan our buildings, when you ring a bell, you don't even see a face anymore, you just talk to a machine, and the person can choose to ignore you. From also other systemic issue is work schedules, and then there's the individual issues, which are often frequent transitions. And personal transitions naturally push you inwards, so you don't have time or energy to be social. So all these combined makes you feel trapped, like I am alone more often than I would like to, and I don't know what to do about it, because other people seem to be fine in the first place. So I realized that for me, and this is actually a personal experience, even though I grew up in Bolivia in a developing country, and most people assume, oh, community is a big deal there, so you probably have lots of family, and you visited your family and your neighbors. Actually not. I lived in a very nuclear family. My parents were divorced, so I only lived with my mom, my grandma, and my sister. We never visited neighbors. We would never drop by unannounced. So my family was very insular. And as I was meditating and learning about the Sabbath, I learned that the Sabbath is about hospitality. And one of the things that I've decided to pick up is challah baking. Mm-hmm. And that's a contemplative prayer time now for me, where as I'm making my challah, I'm thinking of somebody who may be alone or somebody who's struggling. So it's a time to pray. And then when I'm finished with my challah, I share half of it with a neighbor. So I remember my first time, my husband grew up in a small town in Quesnel. And so I said, okay, we're going to take this bread to the neighbor. And I was so anxious to just drop by unannounced. I was like, how are we going to go? He says, we'll just go to the back door and we're going to knock. But we haven't phoned. So I had all these, fears about intrusion or self-imposing. And we ended up going. And then my neighbor, who's a non-believer, he was so hospitable. I felt so humbled. I was like, I should be that hospitable. You're supposed to not be as hospitable. And so it became, for me, actually, an actual freedom. So that Sabbath practice of challah making, and my other most favorite memory is when we had non-believers. It's also a missional practice to have people over for dinner. And this was a non-Christian guy who was Christian at some point, and then when we started breaking bread, he started tearing up, and he said, I had not broken bread in a long time. So for me, this inclusion of people who are outsiders of the faith, and just other time, a couple of weeks ago, we had my couple of friends who have a little kid. I have a little kid too, and I said to them, on Saturdays, we make a special prayer. Do you mind if we do it? You can just watch, or you can participate. And then they said, oh, we'll participate. And it was just so lovely to see them all singing. They are singers, they sing in choir. So it was like this beautiful taste of, oh, this is different, this is too religious maybe, but it's good. And talking about things we're grateful for after dinner, and so that has become the real freedom. And social isolation has this systemic and individual issues. So the systemic part is a resistance to overproductivity. Like, I'm choosing to trust God, that my destiny is not ultimately supported by my efforts or by how much money I make. So the Sabbath is a statement towards that, to that systemic sort of thing.
Great. Well, I think you already touched on it, but we've been discussing about how Samir, if you can throw up the last slide. Yeah, that Sabbath is actually foundational to a discipleship practice and to missional practices as well. When we fully embrace the Sabbath, we have the opportunity, because we've all set aside the same time to gather, to be mentored, to be in community, to serve each other and serve our city. And I think the Sabbath is the gospel. It is good news for people who, as Jesus said, are now heavy burdened and they are looking for rest. But also in getting that restoration and revival and refreshment, they now have something more to offer their neighbors and their coworkers and their family members by carrying that grace and paying it forward and sharing it outward. So just a couple closing comments, and then we're really happy as a church to endorse Mission Fest. And this spring in January, we had a team of like 12 people volunteer to serve the worship service on Sunday, because we have been revived and renewed in our Sabbath worship, and it was such a beautiful thing for our church members to volunteer. And so this coming January, the focus is on discipleship. So I would just love you to give us maybe a closing comment, and then we'll take a look at the video as the kids choir comes to close us in singing.
Amen. So one of the, I don't know if I can have my slide for a minute, my last slide. Is that possible? Okay, great. So there's that, in that triangle, we have a quick sort of nutshell definition of what discipleship is. So it's this three-way love up for the Creator, love for the Creator, in relationship with disciples, and then outward in our love for the world. And the Sabbath is at the heart, because it has everything. You worship God, you are in connection with God. In the Sabbath, you choose to be in community, and then you reach out to others through hospitality. And that's the discipleship that aims to be a foretaste of the future, right? Like you're making a tent in time that is a foretaste of what God is going to bring. And I use the language of shalom, to that perfect harmony that will come when Jesus comes back. So it's a foretaste, and that's what missional discipleship is used in now. Yeah, so we're going to have a video about it. Thank you very much for your support to Missions Fest.
Thank you.
We rake and we sow and garden soil.
I think I had a very rigid understanding of what discipleship and mission was when I was younger. I had this idea that to be a follower of Jesus meant to do the best and the hardest thing. That's what makes God happy. That's what it means to follow Jesus. So we went to India. And I had, I think, been struggling with depression for actually quite a while, but I was just like trying to be so strong and like, I'm a missionary and I had this calling, and I got really sick and I had insomnia. My body physically just broke down and I almost couldn't get out of bed. I was just so sick. And that's when I started having a breakdown. One night I just came to this realization that I was actually really angry at God. And I was just like, I hate that I'm here, and I hate you. And in this like moment of rage, I kind of just heard God say, like, finally, you're being real with me. Abundant life isn't just for Indians, it's for you too. And I realized following Jesus is actually about living out of that abundance that he gives us. And I knew that I was not operating from that place. So I packed up all my stuff, and within a week I was flying back to Canada. My heart, for the first time, was engaged with Vancouver. I never loved a city before in my life, and I moved to Vancouver, and I was like, I love this city, and I love what God's doing here. I look back at India as a time of rescue in my life, a time of rescue from myself. Whether or not we're here or there, we are called to love the world. And I just think with all that we've been given, and a God whose heart is so after the whole world, it is not a task, it is not a job, it is our joy take that story in my life to say that when we're walking in step with the Spirit, we will go all over this world. But I often feel like God is just saying, like, I don't need those big things that you think you have to do. I really just I want your heart, and I want to start with your heart. And then I think from that place, that's where God starts to cultivate whatever he's going to cultivate.